Okay, this video is going to focus on Amendments 2 through 10, the rest of the Bill of Rights. We already spent a lot of time in class focusing on the First Amendment and all its importances, so now we're going to focus on the rest. So it's important that you just kind of follow along, starting on page 4 in your guide and notes packet, and sort of kind of jot down the significant details. So the Second Amendment is the first one that we'll review. This amendment protects an individual's right to own a gun. So if you look at the amendment wording on the left-hand side of their screen, different people argue that that amendment gives different groups the right to own a gun. Some argue that it gives a militia the right to own a gun, which doesn't exist anymore, and others argue that it protects an individual's right to own a gun. And it's really up to a matter of interpretation. It's not until 2008 and the case of DC v. Heller where the Supreme Court decides that the way that amendment should be interpreted is that an individual has a right to own a gun. That's a basic American right that an individual has the right to own a gun. The Supreme Court could change that interpretation at some point, but the way they interpret it now is that it does protect an individual's right to own a firearm. The Third Amendment is not as relevant as a lot of the others. It simply says that you can't be forced to house soldiers against your will. So this is left over from like the pre-Revolutionary War days, where the colonists were upset that the British passed the Quartering Act in 1765, which required the colonists to provide for British soldiers, take them in, house them, feed them, clothe them. The Third Amendment prevents that from happening. This is really not relevant anymore, but these are protections that still every American citizen is guaranteed to. The Fourth Amendment is much more important. It basically establishes the rules and regulations that deal with the way law enforcement can search you and your property. So, the intention of the amendment is that it protects against unlawful searches and seizures by law enforcement. So, law enforcement can search you or your stuff if they obtain a search warrant. And the way that they obtain a search warrant is they go to a judge and they explain probable cause, which is they basically explain why they have a need to search you or your property. If the judge believes that there is good reason to do the search, he will grant the search warrant, and then law enforcement can like engage in the search. They can search you, they can search your property, whatever they need to search. However, if they don't obtain a search warrant and they illegally search you, it is possible that that evidence could be not allowed to be shown at trial. This is called the exclusionary rule. The exclusionary rule is when a defense attorney argues that law enforcement didn't get the evidence in a proper way, a legal way, and therefore they prevent it from being ever shown to the jury during a trial. So, like most extreme example, law enforcement illegally obtains like a murder weapon with fingerprints on it, and they're not allowed to use it at trial because the defense attorney asks the judge to apply the exclusionary rule. Like, hey, judge, this evidence was obtained illegally. It wasn't obtained properly. It shouldn't be used at trial. And if the judge agrees, the jury will never know that that evidence exists, right? So the Fourth Amendment deals with unlawful searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment is important for three different reasons. The first thing that it does, it protects you against double jeopardy. Double jeopardy is when you are tried for the same crime twice. So if you look at the example at the bottom of the screen, Joe Smith is charged with the first-degree murder of Sally Jones. The jury in this case finds Smith not guilty. 5 years later, new evidence is obtained by law enforcement. They may not try him again for first-degree murder. They get one shot, and if they bring it to court and they're unable to do it, you don't have to worry, in this case, Joe Smith, of living the rest of your life under the pressure of being tried again at some point. However, it does work in favor of the accused. Let's say he was found guilty and 5 years later evidence appears that exonerates him. They could have a new trial and he could be declared not guilty. But if you are declared not guilty in your initial trial, you can't be retried again. The second thing that it protects against is self-incrimination. So self-incrimination is when you are made to testify at your own trial. So what the Fifth Amendment prohibits is self-incrimination, meaning you cannot be forced to testify against yourself at your own trial. So again, the example, Joe Smith is charged with the first-degree murder of Sally Jones. Smith decides to plead the fifth. We've all heard that phrase before, which means he's not going to testify at his own trial. Maybe he's worried about slipping up. Maybe he's just not good thinking on his feet. He's afraid of the lawyer is going to make him say something that he doesn't want to say. that is his right not to participate, right? Fifth Amendment prohibits you from self-incriminating yourself. A judge would also tell the jury before the jury deliberates that if the defendant, right, the accused person, pleads the fifth, that can't be held against them when you're deciding guilt or innocence. The third important thing that the Fifth Amendment establishes are rules for eminent domain. Eminent domain is when the government seizes your property for some reason. It just requires they have to give you compensation for the land that they're taking against your will. So, extreme example. Let's say the state of Pennsylvania announces plans to add an extra lane to Route 309, which is a highway that's not that far away. In order to accomplish this, they need to seize property from local homeowners so the highway can be expanded. This would require the state of Pennsylvania to pay these homeowners fair value for whatever property they're taking. They just can't take the property. They have to fairly compensate them for it. So the Fifth Amendment deals with double jeopardy, self-incrimination, and the rules for eminent domain, which is when the government seizes property against your will, they have to compensate you for it. The Sixth Amendment is important for a bunch of different reasons. It basically is significant because it guarantees your basic trial rights. So anything dealing with a fair trial is Sixth Amendment. So the Sixth Amendment guarantees you a speedy trial. This just basically means that you can't be charged with a crime and put in jail initially, waiting for your trial in 2023, and your trial doesn't actually happen until 2033. Right? There's no actual days limit or anything like that, but it has to be relatively quick to resolve the matter one way or other to determine your guilt or innocence. It also guarantees you to an unbiased and fair jury, right? The jury selection process, both sides, the defense and the prosecution, try to make sure that none of the jurors are biased, going into it. And if it can be proven that any of the jurors are biased, that might be grounds for a retrial. So you're guaranteed a fair and unbiased jury. The third thing it guarantees you is the right to confront people that are making accusations against you. So any witness that testifies against you, you have the right to confront them, meaning that your lawyer can cross-examine them. So if somebody's saying something against you, like you did this or you were there on that night, your lawyer has the ability under oath to cross-examine them to kind of poke holes in their story. So it gives you the right to confront witnesses against you so that you can kind of challenge what you're saying. And the last thing it provides you is the right to an attorney. So there are a couple of court cases we'll look at that further define this right, but it guarantees you that if you can't afford an attorney, you don't have to defend yourself. The court will actually appoint an attorney, a public defender, to represent you. So Sixth Amendment is significant. Seventh Amendment, not as relevant, but nonetheless, it's in the Bill of Rights. It guarantees you to a jury trial in civil cases where people are fighting over at least $20. So again, it guarantees you the right to a jury trial, not having a judge just make a decision. If it's a civil case, meaning you're fighting over property or money, and the value you're fighting over is at least $20, right? So again, Seventh Amendment protects jury trials guarantees you a jury trial in civil cases involving amounts at least $20 or more. The Eighth Amendment is important because the first thing it does is it protects you from being exposed to cruel and unusual punishment. So law enforcement can't punish you in whatever way they see fit. For example, someone's accused of shoplifting a loaf of bread from Wawa. The punishment can't be chopping off their hands. So again, you can't be tortured. The punishment has to be reasonable, and it can't be cruel or unusual. It is important to note that the Supreme Court has not considered the use of the death penalty to violate the Eighth Amendment. They don't think it's cruel and unusual punishment. Now, there are some exceptions to this. So, for example, in 2004, the case of Roper v. Simmons decided that though it's not cruel and unusual to execute individuals in normal trials, it is cruel and unusual to execute minors. So the Roper v. Simmons case establishes the fact that if you are under the age of 18, you cannot be sentenced to death in this country, no matter what crime you commit. Also, the case of Atkins v. Virginia further decided that though the death penalty itself is not cruel and unusual, if it can be proven that the individual that is found guilty is mentally ill, then it would be cruel and unusual to execute them. So, in general, the death penalty does not violate the Eighth Amendment unless it's being applied to a minor or someone who is basically deemed to be mentally ill. The second thing that the Eighth Amendment protects against is excessive bail being set. So, if you are allowed to leave jail waiting for your trial, like you post bail, it has to be sort of like reasonable to whatever you're being accused of. So, for example, again, if you shoplift a loaf of bread from Wawa, they can't set your bail at $1 million, right? So it just prohibits you from either being excessively fined or having an excessive bail set. So that's the Eighth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment, the Tenth Amendment, we talked a little bit earlier in the year when we did federalism. The Ninth Amendment establishes that citizens have more rights than what are listed in the Constitution. So the Federalists originally opposed the Bill of Rights because they feared that if you list people's rights, like you couldn't possibly come up with a list that was long enough to include every right that an individual has. So the Federalists agreed that like they would do a Bill of Rights in order to get the Constitution approved, but they wanted something added in so that future generations would know that this is just a good starting point, that these aren't the only rights that you have, right? So the Ninth Amendment just says that you actually have more rights than what are listed in the Bill of Rights. And the Tenth Amendment sort of works opposite. It basically says that the national government, right, can only do what's listed in the Constitution, right? The national government is limited. So, like, citizens have rights that are not listed in the Constitution, but the national government is not supposed to be doing more than what is specifically listed in the Constitution. Everything that is unstated, right, basically is supposed to belong to the state governments. However, right, it's important to know that a future Supreme Court ruling after the 10th Amendment was ratified has really reduced the impact of the 10th Amendment. So you remember we talked about the 1819 case of McCullough versus Maryland, where the Supreme Court basically said that the necessary and proper clause allows the government to do more than what's listed in the Constitution. As long as what you want to do can be linked up to something that is in the Constitution, Supreme Court most times will let you get away with it. So though the 10th Amendment is supposed to limit the government to only to be able to do what's in the Constitution, the future McCullough versus Maryland decision really kind of limits the significance of this amendment, right? So this is like the Bill of Rights in a quick snapshot. We already talked about the First Amendment, and this covers Amendments 2 through 10.